When a tornado siren sounds, you're lucky to have half an hour to take shelter.
But a tornado can form and dissipate within seconds, and that's a very difficult forecasting challenge.
For some, the first warning is the sight of a giant gray vortex of extreme wind, twisting violently across the horizon.
Oh my God.
And then, catastrophe. Homes reduced to rubble, cars tossed like tin toys, families torn apart.
Not many things are designed to withstand 200-mile-an-hour wind.
Scientists are still chasing answers to what causes the fastest winds on the face of the Earth.
We're trying to understand why some tornadoes become very intense and become the real killer F4 and F5 tornadoes that we're most concerned about.
We actually don't know some of the last processes that really make a storm form a tornado.
Unraveling the tracks of killer tornadoes may help us one day understand exactly when and where the next big outbreak will strike. Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the Earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? The United States of America is a hotbed for tornadoes. More strike here than any other country on Earth. But the spring of 2011 brought devastation to numerous states in the biggest and most destructive outbreak in US history. In an extraordinary 4-day stretch in April, 360 tornadoes ripped through multiple states, killing hundreds and racking up a $12 billion bill.
Hey! He's over! Let him on, go!
It was the second catastrophic outbreak that month. The first began as a strong low-pressure system traveled across the central plains of the US, pulling up warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. As it interacted with a mass of cool, dry air blowing through from Canada, a line of supercell thunderstorms began to form, setting the scene for explosive, severe weather.
A supercell thunderstorm is a very strong and persistent thunderstorm. They can last for hours. The key ingredient is that they are rotating and tilted. These tilted, rotating thunderstorms we see in the high plains in Tornado Alley can last for hours and hours and sometimes produce multiple and violent tornadoes.
You need the air to be very unstable, and that means the air wants to rise violently. There's air that's very low density at the surface, and there's air that's very high density above. The atmosphere wants to flip, it wants to go up violently and change. You also need very strong winds.
If cool, descending dry air passes over rising, warm, moist air, it's the perfect setup for a flip. This happens in a normal thunderstorm, which can quickly kill itself off.
What will happen is that the rain will fall back down and kill off the original updraft, and you'll have basically a life cycle of a normal, what they call an air mass thunderstorm.
To brew up a supercell, you need an added ingredient of strong, multi-directional winds at different altitudes.
And then the real key ingredient is something that we call wind shear. So it's winds in the atmosphere that change speed with height, and they also change direction with height. Basically what it does is it creates rotation, but this rotation is horizontal. As you know, a tornado is vertical. So what ends up happening is this horizontal rotation, these supercells have very big, strong updrafts. Basically, it gets tilted into the vertical. So then you get the supercell. So you get this rotating thunderstorm.
And that rotation acts to bring the rain off to the side of the updraft and allows the supercell to exist as an entity much, much longer than an ordinary air mass thunderstorm.
Instead of cooling itself off, a rotating supercell just keeps on going.
And those are usually the strongest thunderstorms, and they're associated with the most severe weather. So winds, hail, and then tornadoes. And usually the strongest tornadoes come from these supercell thunderstorms.
Large tornado crossing the highway just in front of us.
And then it becomes a tricky part of how the tornado actually forms. So there's downdrafts and updrafts associated with this rotating part of the supercell. As this downdraft is coming down, it's bringing down rotation to the surface.
But only a small fraction of supercells produce tornadoes, which is another forecasting challenge.
On the 14th of April, the old river town of Poplar Bluff in Missouri copped a severe hailstorm. It followed a 4-day deluge that drenched the region with 15 inches of rain and broke the banks of the Black River. And then came the tornadoes, one after another.
These outbreaks tend to be a number of supercells that are spawning one after another tornado. That's why they're so destructive, because it's not like one and done. The tornado may dissipate, but then it's usually followed by another tornado.
Over the next 3 days, more than 150 tornadoes rampaged from Oklahoma to the Carolinas in an extraordinary severe weather blitz that killed at least 38 people, becoming the most active outbreak on record. In North Carolina, 30 tornadoes caused 22 fatalities, a state record. Days later, in a terrifying start to Easter, 2 large supercell thunderstorms moved into St. Louis, Missouri, sparking 5 tornadoes. The worst, a large E4, barreled through the terminals at Missouri's International Airport. 3 planes were on the tarmac, full of passengers, who rode out the most severe turbulence imaginable while still firmly on the ground. Outside the terminal, the extreme wind tossed vehicles about, including one van that was nearly pushed off the edge of an upper-level car park. A large section of the roof was torn off. Many of the glass doors and panes shattered. While many travel plans were shredded by the event, the biggest miracle of the Good Friday tornado was that no one was seriously hurt. A few days later, the super outbreak began to brew. A gigantic, long wave trough came in from the west, sending alarm bells ringing throughout the Central Plains. Weather forecasts look set for hell to unleash across multiple states. The Storm Prediction Center issued a particularly dangerous situation tornado watch for Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, part of the famed Tornado Alley.
The United States is really a great place for tornadoes because a lot of the key ingredients come together. And in particular, they come together a lot of times in the early spring in the central part of the United States, what's commonly known as Tornado Alley.
Much of the landscape is flat plains, as far as the eye can see, lying between 2 mountain ranges, the Rockies and the Appalachian.
It is just a hot spot where there's typically a lot of instability. There's a lot of wind shear, and it just is a prime area for very, very severe thunderstorms. Because we have the Gulf of Mexico, which has an enormous amount of warm, moist air that comes out from the south into the plains, but also the Rocky Mountains, which helps produce very cool, dry air that comes in aloft. sets itself up for overturning. And that overturning, when the warm, moist air goes violently upwards, that's how you form a thunderstorm.
But uniquely in North America, there's an overlap between where that warm, moist air is flowing north from the Gulf of Mexico and waves that are still left over from late winter and early spring in the jet stream.
Jet streams are ribbons of wind that circle the globe at high altitudes. As they surge over the Rockies heading east, waves in the wind belt help deliver a good dose of spin and speed to the cool, dry air. This provides the wind shear and rotation needed for supercell thunderstorms.
If those ingredients all occur, then the Storm Prediction Center, which does forecast for tornadoes, will issue sort of an outlook that says this area looks prime for tornadoes.
On the evening of the 25th, the first tornado to cause multiple deaths hit Valonia in Faulkner County, Arkansas. It was an EF2 wedge tornado. Wedge tornadoes get their name because they're so fat and wide, they sometimes look like a block of black clouds jammed into the ground.
And they always say it sounds like a train. It didn't. It just was a loud wind. Our ears popped, and then just in seconds it was over.
Valonia is little more than a street in the center of farmland. The storm churned through the center of it, flattening mobile homes, flipping trailers and downing trees.
We need boots on the ground. We need people here with hands-on, moving stuff, piling stuff.
4 people were killed, a toll which could have been much worse had the town not received a 30-minute warning.
I think we're pretty good at trying to forecast supercells or tornadic thunderstorms. The difficulty is if that thunderstorm will produce a tornado and when will it produce a tornado. If you ask me what's that fraction, about 20 to 25% of all rotating thunderstorms produce tornadoes.
There is no long-range forecasting of tornadoes, only the conditions that make them likely to happen. The average lead time during the April outbreaks was about 25 minutes.
But then we have what we call the Storm Prediction Center. The SPC is looking at the weather everywhere, basically really only looking at the severe weather threat. So we're taking observations all the time in our atmosphere, and these are being fed into computer models. So we're watching these systems come across, looking for key ingredients that make up supercells, because supercells are what's going to make the strongest tornadoes.
Aspects of tornado formation remain a mystery, and the science of forecasting is relatively young.
But a tornado can form and dissipate within seconds, within minutes, and that's just a very difficult forecasting challenge.
Because they are so short-lived and unpredictable, getting clear images has historically been part of the problem. The 1957 Dallas tornado was a turning point in tornado research. As it churned a deadly 25-kilometer path through a metropolitan area, it was clearly visible for around 40 minutes. It became one of the best documented tornadoes. More than 100 people caught it on film. From these clips and other photographs, scientists were able to estimate wind velocities and the speed of the tornado. Engineers were also able to relate those speeds to damages on the ground. In that storm, 500 were made homeless, 200 injured, and 10 people perished.
Most of the reports of tornadoes came from unscientific observation. They'd go out and interview the farmer, what happened here? And the farmer would say something like, well, we lost the roof in this house, and for some reason here, my chicken was completely plucked after the tornado went through. And then have to figure out, well, you know, what is the wind that it would take to pluck a chicken? Those kind of things, right? By the early 60s, the interstate highway system had been completed in the US, and so it became possible to navigate your way to a thunderstorm and start making scientific observations. One of the researchers there, a guy named Neil Ward, was the first person to get the idea to get in his car and chase after a thunderstorm. What he found is that there is a very characteristic set of events in these thunderstorms that precede the tornado formation. For example, they find that there is a cloud base, and before the tornado forms is a lowering of the cloud base called a wall cloud. Then there's a rain shaft that is basically on the backside of the wall cloud. So there were just a number of scientific observations.
The study of tornadoes took a huge leap in the 70s when a team of scientists first managed to intercept a tornado with an experimental Doppler radar. On May 24th, 1973, conditions in Oklahoma were lining up for tornado formation, and an array of instruments and cameras were set up in the field, ready for the chance.
There was a severe tornado case, and it actually led to the development or formation of the National Severe Storms Lab. They chose a good location.
Right on cue, an F4 tornado ripped through the farming town of Union City, and for the first time, scientists were able to capture its entire life cycle with radar, from start to finish. It changed tornado forecasting forever.
The National Severe Storms Laboratory is a national laboratory funded by NOAA, which also funds the National Weather Service, the Storm Prediction Center, the Hurricane Center, all these groups that are associated with forecasting weather. But the Severe Storms Laboratory focuses on research which can be very quickly applied to making better forecasts of tornadoes and other severe storms, including hailstorms and flash floods and other phenomena.
Doppler radar scans of the Union City tornado led to two critical discoveries: that rotating thunderstorms could lead to tornado formation, and that a tornado vortex signature, a strong radar indication of circulation, often appeared about 25 minutes before the tornado. Here, they had two critical potential warning devices, which could save many lives. Just 1 year after the Union City tornado, the super outbreak of 1974 occurred. It remains the deadliest spate of US tornadoes on record. As the National Weather Services were still using 1950s equipment for forecasting, warnings were virtually non-existent. It was a particularly violent outbreak, carrying with it 30 EF4 and EF5 tornadoes. 335 people were killed and 6,000 injured.
Sounded like a big train whistle, and we were right underneath the front of it. I've never seen anything like it, and I don't want to again.
Although a horrendous toll, the 1974 outbreak brought critical changes that saved lives in the future.
I don't know. It was just terrible.
Most importantly, money for tornado intercept research increased.
What can you do? We've lost everything that we had.
Secondly, they brought in the Fujita scale as a standard language for scientists to discuss and reference different strength tornadoes.
There's something we use called the Enhanced Fujita scale. Really what it is it's a damage-based scale. So looking at damage, wind speeds are inferred.
Tornadoes are rated by the amount of damage they do. So if tornadoes break a few branches, they're F0 or F1. If they completely wipe houses down to their foundation, so there's nothing left but the slab, that's an F5. In between, there are different levels of damage, from lifting off a roof, maybe that's F1, to removing a bunch of walls, that might be F2. There are a lot finer details than that, but roughly it's the level of destruction that a home or other structure experiences.
If a tornado has ferocious winds, but lands in a rural area with no destruction of property, they will receive a low rating, even those that normally cause the total obliteration of well-built structures.
So if a strong tornado with 400 km/h winds goes through open wind fields, it's rated F0. In some sense, that's kind of silly because we know it's much stronger than that. Even if we measure winds stronger than that with a radar, it's officially rated F0 because of the damage. We are working with the American Society of Civil Engineers to develop a standard that uses all available evidence, including damage, radar measurements, anemometers, to try to come up with the most comprehensive and most accurate measurement of tornado winds.
Get in the basement!
Although only around 1% of tornadoes in the US are classified on the top end of the scale, an EF4 or EF5, the majority of deaths are in these two classes. Any tornado that has a greater chance of hitting an urban area is likely to be higher rated, do more damage, and kill more people.
Huh? Yeah.
With the advent of the Doppler radar, it's become possible for researchers to measure the extreme speeds of tornado vortexes. Doppler radar uses microwave beams to sweep through storms. These microwaves can be reflected off particles such as rain, hail, and other debris. The radar uses the Doppler effect to work out which direction and how fast these particles are traveling, by how they change the reflected signal. If the object is moving away from the antenna, a lower frequency signal is detected. Higher if the object is moving towards the antenna. A computer translates the information into a visual representation, where different frequencies are viewed as different colors, representing speed and direction.
I lead the Center for Severe Weather Research, which operates the Doppler on Wheels mobile radar fleet, and also other instruments that we drop in front of tornadoes, hurricanes, other kinds of interesting weather. We've compressed everything and made it rugged and mobile so we can chase to the weather. We can go to tornadoes instead of waiting for them to come to us. By getting up close, we can see the fingerprints, the small details that you just can't see from farther away. We're trying to understand the map of the winds inside tornadoes. Where are the strongest winds? How are they doing damage? We're trying to watch the birth process of tornadoes and understand why some thunderstorms produce tornadoes and some don't. We're trying to understand why some tornadoes become very intense and become the real killer F4 and F5 tornadoes that we're most concerned about.
Using radar, wind speeds of incredibly destructive strengths can be measured.
We try to get really close, and what we could do is we can map out the 2- and 3-dimensional structure with the radar. And the closer you get, the lower down you can look inside the tornado, and the closer you get to the surface, those are the winds that are actually really impacting buildings and structures and people.
Perhaps the strongest winds produced on the face of the Earth is associated with tornadoes. Recent studies using mobile Doppler radars have documented unambiguous winds of around 135 to 140 meters per second, almost 300 miles an hour winds. It's an amazing number. The fascinating thing is the tornado, how can it produce such a strong wind locally compacted at the base of the funnel of a tornado? There's a very good radar network across the US now. You can actually see rotation in the storm, which is also an indicator of tornado genesis.
Rotation in a storm can be seen as a characteristic hook, the tornado itself as a coupling of green and red intense bands. Doppler radar can also help forecasters identify tornado signatures, like debris balls. which are areas of high reflectivity, where debris is carried aloft in the tornado. Particularly strong tornadoes can have massive debris balls, like the EF5 Bridge Creek tornado.
One of the strongest tornadoes we've ever observed was in central Oklahoma, near Bridge Creek and Moore in 1999. That tornado went directly through a metropolitan area, so had very high impact, killed almost 40 people, destroyed thousands of homes, just this one tornado. And we measured the strongest winds we've ever seen, or I think anybody has ever seen, over 300 miles an hour, almost 500 kilometers per hour. The damage in that tornado was not just F5, it was very, serious F5 level damage. Homes were just wiped and scoured off their foundations. Fields and lawns were scoured with the grass removed. It was a very dramatically strong tornado that caused bad impacts, strong impacts to the areas it hit.
I walked into the tree line, caught a movement out the corner of my eye. Under some debris around the base of a tree, I seen what appeared to be a baby.
Oklahoma City is near the heart of Tornado Alley in the US, and Moore has had its fair share, being struck more than 20 times by tornadoes, a number of them particularly violent and destructive. On the afternoon of May 20th, 2013, another long-lived EF5 tornado mowed through the town. Whole neighborhoods looked as though they'd been thrown in a blender. So unrecognizable that street signs had to be urgently printed so that rescuers could map out where they were. In the direct path of the tornado lay 2 elementary schools. Parents arrived to pick up their children from school, only to discover in horror that virtually nothing was left of the buildings. Miraculously, no one died at Briarwood Elementary, but 7 children perished at Plaza Towers. Neither of the schools had shelters. After the devastation, there was an outcry for change. School districts across the state called for greater funding to afford every at-risk school a tornado shelter. EF5 tornadoes are extremely rare, but the super outbreak of 2011 had 3 and 12 EF4s, which helps explain why such widespread destruction occurred. Most of the violent tornadoes struck on one awful day, April 27, with more than 300 deaths occurring in the space of 24 hours. Alabama bore the brunt of it.
The 2011 outbreak was largely in the southeast. Tuscaloosa and Birmingham were particularly hard hit.
In Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, the first wave brought nearly 3 dozen twisters that morning, knocking out communications and power. Few expected a second round of supercells were about to whip up the most violent and long-lived tornadoes. That afternoon, an incredibly wide EF4, which spanned more than 26 football fields, churned across 130 kilometers of landscape. Wind speeds were greater than 300 kilometers an hour. 65 people were killed in that single event. The cost of simply removing the extensive debris from Tuscaloosa was estimated at $100 million.
I'm grateful that we survived it, but it was one of the most horrifying experiences I think I've ever experienced in my life.
Sometimes that surprises people because people say, well, that's not Tornado Alley. Tornado Alley is Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa sort of area. But actually down in the southeast, they can get pretty severe tornadoes too.
Alabama lies in the tornado-prone Dixie Alley, a loosely defined southeastern region. Although it gets less tornadoes than the better-known Tornado Alley, generally, they are longer-lived. Dixie Alley is the deadliest region for tornadoes, but this is not based on wind speeds alone. Dixie Alley bucks the seasonal trends for tornadoes. They can even occur in winter. Many also happen at night. This leaves people less ready to respond to a warning, more likely to be taken by surprise.
I knew I was in deep trouble when I saw the building coming apart across the highway here. And the next thing I knew, I was rolling.
Half of the nation's mobile homes are located in the southeast.
I had lived in the trailer east of you. Unfortunately, I was lucky, just twisted the top off of mine.
According to the Storm Prediction Center, most tornado deaths happen in mobile homes.
But unfortunately, my brother wasn't so lucky. Tornado hit it and tore it all to pieces.
Which are far less structurally sound than a well-built house. Dixie Alley also has a different landscape. Much of it is covered in trees, is hilly and humid. Clouds hang lower, and tornadoes can be harder to see. Because Dixie Alley is closer to the Gulf, it also increases the likelihood of violent, rain-wrapped tornadoes.
Rain-wrapped tornadoes is literally where there's a curtain of rain that just sort of wraps around the tornado, so it's a good descriptive term. The danger with that is it often hides the tornado visually. So if you're not fortunate enough to have a radar with you, for example, you may not even see the tornado and not realize it's right behind this curtain of rain.
How big a tornado actually is seems to be as much a matter of opinion as it is science.
Defining tornado size is problematic because everyone has their own definition. People who are out chasing look at the condensation funnel and say, that's how wide the tornado is. Worse, they're just looking at it and estimating and saying, that looks 2 miles wide. It's very crude, just eyewitness reports of what they think they're seeing. The Weather Service rates tornadoes by how wide a swath of damage they make. My team rates tornadoes by how big the wind circulation is, because we're making detailed maps of what the winds are. Still, some tornadoes are much, much wider than others. The widest tornado that we've ever documented, and we're in agreement with other methods of documenting width of tornadoes, was back in 2013 in central Oklahoma, near a town called El Reno. And that tornado had a width of damaging winds that we mapped that at times was 4 or 5 kilometers wide. It was extremely broad. But this was a very complex tornado. It didn't just have a single swirl of wind. Inside that were these other most violent features of the tornado that were spinning around it.
Like many multi-vortex tornadoes, the El Reno twister proved to be highly unpredictable, dangerous, and difficult to navigate.
The tornado essentially breaks down into multiple funnels, all rotating around a common core. That actually happens fairly commonly with all tornadoes. Perhaps the unique aspect of the El Reno tornado is because the tornado itself was very large. These multiple funnels or suction vortices were also very large. It was one of the largest funnels ever. It was, we believe, an EF5 tornado, but it actually was rated EF3. There was some controversy about that.
Although El Reno was only initially rated an EF3 because of the damage, individual vortices were some of the strongest ever recorded. The highest measurement of 475 kilometers an hour was the second fastest wind speed measured, just below the Bridge Creek tornado. The twister killed 20 people, including a team of researchers attempting to document the tornado. One of the most famous and deadly multi-vortex tornadoes descended on the western edge of the city of Joplin, Missouri, on May 22nd, 2011.
The Joplin tornado is well known because it went right through a medium-sized small city.
Back up. Oh no.
And it turns out to be the 7th deadliest tornado in history. Why that's remarkable is the other tornadoes that were in that same ranking occurred many, many years, decades ago. So you would think with all the new technology, with all the new computers, with all the new satellite technology, how did we have an event that ranks number 7 on the fatality list of tornadoes?
The EF5 touched down at 5:41 p.m. on a Sunday evening, and weather services knew in advance it was coming.
Why so many people died? Turns out it wasn't because the forecast was bad, because that might be one of the first guesses. Well, the forecast must have been terrible. They had no warning. They had actually quite a bit of warning. It turns out that a large part of this was the social response from the people. They went back and checked, and a lot of the people that heard the alarm go off waited to hear another confirmation. Somebody calling them to confirm that you better get out of the way, or watching on TV to see maybe a TV weather forecaster to come on. That delay of waiting for a second confirmation was not good. People needed to move, and they needed to move very quickly.
Joplin residents had almost half an hour to take shelter, but many didn't heed the warnings because they'd become desensitized to sirens.
I heard him screaming, Chris! Kathy, where the stuff? Kathy, somebody in here!
There's always a worry that you're crying wolf too much. That's been one of the hardest things to sort of reduce the false alarm rates.
Oh, come here, sweetie. Come here, honey. Come here, sweetie. It's okay.
It's not just hard science research. There's a social science aspect of how people react to warnings. And with the Joplin case, that couldn't be better illustrated. And that is what led to so many people dying. They simply didn't get out of the way when they were warned well ahead of time.
It hit a substantial part of the town, so residential places, commercial places, and then also the Joplin Hospital was also impacted by that tornado.
Views of the damage from the air give an idea of just how big and destructive the multi-vortex tornado was. Entire neighborhoods were blown away.
What we say about suction vortices is that if you've looked at aerial damage photos, oftentimes you sort of see marks like this along a tornado track. I often call them spirograph marks because that's literally what it is. And that's where the biggest or the strongest damage tends to occur.
In 40 terrifying minutes, it devoured more than 7,000 homes, nearly 500 businesses, and claimed 161 lives.
I had done an analysis several years before asking what if? What if a Joplin-like tornado, what if a strong tornado like we had seen in Bridge Creek or even El Reno went through St. Louis or went through Chicago or went through Atlanta? And the what if consequences were huge. You could damage 50, 100,000 different homes. Potentially you could kill 1,000 people if you went through the suburbs of one of these large cities. That was very hypothetical until we had seen Joplin. If the Joplin tornado had occurred just 50 miles from where it went through Joplin, if it had gone through suburban St. Louis, you could have had outcomes much worse than that. And that was very sobering for those of us who were looking at these worst case kind of what if scenarios.
Some scientists actually question whether the F5 was a high enough rating on the Fujita scale or whether we actually needed a higher rating on that scale to put into context how big that tornado really was. And the Joplin tornado was especially devastating in that it destroyed approximately 1/3 of the physical landscape. Joplin is characterized as a near-miss event because it actually occurred on a Sunday. Had the Joplin tornado occurred on a school day, school administrators there after that terrible storm acknowledged that many school children likely would have perished in the Joplin schools that were so badly devastated in that tornado event.
The giant tornado caused damage to around 3/4 of Joplin's buildings. The following day, Missouri Task Force 1 was sent in to start clearing up the damage and searching for missing persons.
I hope you do find somebody. Find information, write it in a marker on their head if they do not have a head or a proper place to write. Write it on their torso. I don't want to see any information on their limbs. Okay. Don't worry about desecrating somebody's loved one. You're not. You're giving us information so we can get the loved one to them. They'll clean them up before they see him. Okay?
Dog teams scoured piles of rubble to try to establish where people lay buried.
Everything's gone. Nothing's ever gonna be the same again. Nothing's ever gonna be the same again.
Even as scores of volunteers arrived to help clean up the disaster, the city remained in a state of high alert as storms gathered on the horizon once more and began to pummel the city. Although they can bring the highest wind speeds known to man, the chances of surviving a severe tornado are high if the warnings are heeded.
When there is a warning, that means a tornado either is coming towards their area or might come towards their area very soon. And they should take action. They should take reasonable action to either get to an interior room of their house, or if there's a community shelter, if they're living in manufactured homes, get to one of those community shelters that's stronger. They should, as much as possible, really try to stay calm and organized. It's when people panic, people start to make poor decisions. They either try to run away or they don't pay attention and they watch it. They get mesmerized and stare at it. Or they go into a ditch where it might flood.
You know, a lot of people drive towards it because they want to get a better look. The sensible thing to do is try to get away. You know, not many things are designed to withstand a 200-mile-an-hour wind. If you have a hole in the ground to crawl into, you should do that.
Quick thinking may have saved many children during a deadly tornado outbreak in Indiana, March 2012. At least 10 tornadoes touched down in Indiana. One of them, a direct hit on Henryville High. Luckily, the school had evacuated its pupils before disaster struck, but some were still on the way home in a school bus. Surveillance video from inside the bus shows what may have been in store for the students had their bus driver not raced the storm and made it back to the school and under cover 3 minutes before the twister struck. The empty bus was blown into a building, but no one was harmed.
Of course, that isn't the place you want to be. Any vehicle is not good in a tornado.
The tornado ran for a remarkable 77 kilometers and lasted almost an hour, hitting not just Henryville, but several other locations in its path. Right after it passed through, an EF-1 was hot on its heels, churning through almost exactly the same track. As if the two tornadoes weren't quite enough, baseball-size hail also came down, the largest ever recorded in Indiana, 12 centimeters in diameter. One of the most tragic stories to emerge from the disaster was the near-miracle survival of little Angel Babcock. The toddler was found barely alive in a field after the tornadoes had swept through. Her entire family had been picked up by the vortex and dropped 100 yards from their home. All were dead, except little Angel, who spent 3 days in critical condition before being taken off life support.
Oh, they loved her. I mean, we all loved all those kids.
The severe outbreak that early March also hit Kentucky, Ohio, and Alabama, killing more than 40 people. Each year, seasonal outbreaks across the US bring their own set of tragedies, but even forecasters were shocked by how severe April 2011 became. The total number of tornadoes spawned that month, more than 750, represented nearly a 5-fold increase on the norm. Why these outbreaks spawn so many tornadoes is not certain, but recent research suggests it could be part of a disturbing trend. In 2014, a Columbia University study found that the number of tornadoes and extreme outbreaks has jumped dramatically, roughly doubling over the last 50 years. Could this be due to climate change?
Do we see a very distinct relationship between tornadic activity and climate change? And the answer is no. If you ask me, has there been any change in recent years about tornado activity? And the answer to that is yes. There seems to be more tornadoes than outbreaks. The number of tornadoes in an outbreak have gotten more extreme, but no one has been able to link that to climate change.
As the world warms, the oceans are also warming, which adds to the amount of moisture and energy powering storms.
Tornadoes are much trickier to deal with. Tornadoes come from supercell storms. The climate change element is adding a little bit of extra instability. It's making the potential for a supercell thunderstorm to be a little bit greater. Whether the wind shear occurs or not is a bit of a crapshoot. I don't think that has much to do with climate change one way or the other. But when the tornado outbreaks have occurred, they tend to be a bit bigger and more damaging in recent years.
While the Columbia team found no evidence of increasing instability over the US, they did find a substantial increase in storm relative helicity, the potential for rotational storms to occur due to wind conditions. Current models don't suggest this will increase in a warming climate, so the cause remains a mystery. While tornadoes are the main subject of much passionate and focused research, many aspects of their genesis remain unknown.
What I find interesting about tornadoes is they're a little difficult to predict, so there's an element of surprise about them, and you don't know sometimes if tornadoes are going to be really strong or really weak. We actually don't know some of the last processes that really make a storm form a tornado.
We've made some major progress in understanding tornado structure. We've made progress in understanding some of the important processes involved with tornado genesis, the birth of tornadoes. So we know what days have enough energy for thunderstorms to form. We know which days we're going to get waves in the jet stream. What's not so good are the details, and of course those details are what matter to people living in the paths of the tornadoes.
For those that live in the path of tornadoes, there are many questions that need to be answered to adequately know the difference between a bad storm on the horizon and imminent destruction.
The details are when exactly are the tornadoes going to form? Of those 6 different supercells, which 1 or 2 are going to make the tornadoes? Of those 1 or 2 that are going to make the tornadoes, when during their 1 or 2 hour lifespan, and exactly what track will they take? Those are the details we don't know. And those are the details that we're really trying to learn.
I'm fascinated by tornadoes because they're so unpredictable, they're so powerful, and they really affect at least a part of the population.
The questions burning in the minds of tornado researchers, who often risk their lives to answer them, have already saved countless people. In the last half-century, the improvements to detection and warning systems mean typically many less people die each season, despite an exploding population. Even to those who live in the bullseye of Tornado Alley, cars, guns, and fire remain a much deadlier daily risk than a tornado.
You know, the thing why people don't lose too much sleep about it is because the probability of you being hit by this little tiny funnel over this great expanse of territory is small.
The most catastrophic natural disasters in human history happen when earthquakes hit large populations that aren't prepared.
Madame Martel, il y a 3 jours en jeudi à la moi si mettre le dehors en bas des dalles. Nous retirer sous lui.
There's mysteries that we may never solve. The one we'd love to solve is predicting the earthquakes.
We don't have warnings that an earthquake is going to come in terms of knowing exactly where and how big an earthquake will be.
Even a relatively minor quake can threaten millions and kill hundreds of thousands when it strikes a vulnerable country.
One of the things that we need to keep in mind about disasters is that the physical event is merely the trigger.
By unleashing vicious cycles of tragedy, building collapses, disease outbreaks, landslides, civil unrest, and urban conflict, earthquakes change communities for generations.
We can't control nature, but we can control how well prepared we are.
Amid the death and devastation, each major earthquake leaves crucial lessons for survival.
It often requires a tragedy to bring about change, or to recognize that there is a need to change.
What have we learned from living with earthquakes? And how will that help us when our world starts shaking? Around the world, humanity exists only moments from catastrophe. Disaster bubbles below the surface of the earth, strikes from the heavens, or engulfs us from the sea. But we are not merely at the mercy of our planet. In our pursuit of industry, global connectivity, and reach for the stars, lives have been lost. Disasters reveal the best and worst of mankind, as one tragedy compounds another. How do these disasters occur? And what lessons can equip us when catastrophe strikes again? Between North and South America is the Caribbean, a chain of hundreds of islands. One of the largest, Haiti, is the most mountainous Caribbean nation, with a population of more than 10 million people. One of the world's poorest countries, tropical Haiti is no stranger to natural disasters like floods and cyclones. Over the last few centuries, it's been hit by at least 15 major earthquakes. But the one that struck Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, on a January afternoon in 2010 has become infamous. Not so much for the size of the earthquake, but for the extreme devastation it caused.
Disasters are not events, they are the end point of social processes. Haiti is unfortunately a real example of how long-term processes that impoverish people, that lead to environmental degradation, that lead to mass migration to urban centers and uncontrolled development. We see this not only in Haiti, but in so many other parts of the developing world. And these processes over time, over decades, maybe even over centuries, lead to the buildup of risk, lead to the disaster that's waiting to happen when a trigger like an earthquake comes along.
But to really understand the genesis of this disaster, we need to start deep in geological time, with the formation of the Earth itself. Like the other rocky planets in our solar system, Earth was formed over billions of years as debris, both small and massive, collided and clumped together. Each impact transferred energy in the form of heat, which is still trapped inside the innermost layers of the Earth's core, reinforced by natural radioactivity. This rigid covering on the Earth's surface is broken into a dozen or so major pieces, known as tectonic plates.
It breaks into a set of plates that shuffle as the material underneath turns over to let out the heat.
They move around and they jostle, they rub against each other, and in some cases they dive beneath each other. Stress builds up on zones of weakness, like at the plate boundaries, but also on faults interior to the plates.
And it takes stress accumulating for decades or centuries before the forces build up to where it cracks and breaks and moves.
The cracking and breaking of the crust creates faults, of which there are three main types. A normal fault forms when force pulls the crust apart and the hanging wall drops down. A reverse fault, or thrust fault, forms when force pushes the crust together and the hanging wall moves up. And transcurrent, or strike-slip faults move the crust walls horizontally, not up or down.
The rupture will then spread over the fault and can spread 1,000 kilometers or more for a really large earthquake.
And when it slips, it radiates vibrational energy out through the ground. And it turns out only 10% of the energy in the earthquake comes out as the shaking. The rest goes into cracking and heating. But that 10% of the energy that's shaking is what we notice and what causes all the damage.
In a sense, we can trace the origin of earthquakes today back to the birth of the solar system. But all that is cold comfort to the people of Haiti, who happen to live on a turbulent shunting yard of tectonic plates.
Broad plate tectonics that drove the forces that caused the Haiti earthquake was an interaction between the Caribbean plate and the North American plate. The North American plate actually wraps around the Caribbean plate, and the Caribbean plate moves eastward relative to the North American plate. And when it impinges the North American plate to the east, it actually goes underneath the Caribbean plate. And then to the west, the North American plate and the Caribbean plate actually slide past each other. So the Haiti earthquake happened kind of in a region where both these effects were going on.
Parts of the fault have been locked for centuries, accumulating stress. Without warning, they suddenly let go just before 5 in the afternoon on the 12th of January, 2010. The epicenter, where the tectonic stress was released, was less than 25 kilometers from Haiti's most populous city, Port-au-Prince. The impact was so devastating that the true death toll may never be known.
The estimates range from 80,000 to 330,000, with most people agreeing that it was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 220,000.
N'appelle marié avec madame. Et madame Maté là, il y a 3 jours en deux jours là, moi si mettre le dehors en bas des dalles. Nous retirer sous lui.
The earthquake was a magnitude 7, and it was deadly.
What made it deadly was the fact that it was very close to a populated center. There were about 2.4 million people exposed to violent shaking from the Haiti earthquake. What turned this from a disaster into a catastrophe was the fact that those buildings in the region were very brittle and could fall in the earthquake shaking.
Within the Caribbean, Most countries there use the Caribbean Uniform Building Code, but not so in Haiti. And so as a result, when they did have that earthquake, you had a very vulnerable building stock, and hence you had the consequences that we saw.
Many of the multi-story buildings of Port-au-Prince became death traps when their unreinforced brick walls broke apart, piling up concrete floor slabs in what's known as a pancake collapse.
The shaking causes a disintegration of the columns and the walls that are supporting the floors, and then you basically end up with a stack of floor slabs. And in some cases, you can have multi-story buildings ending up as a great big stack of floor slabs, and you could just imagine the consequences, you know, for people in that building at the time.
That was my father's house, so we lose it. My mother was.
Now we have somebody here.
There's some person inside the house.
We can't find him. We don't have a loader to take them out.
Beyond the immediate aftermath, earthquakes in poor or politically paralyzed countries set off a chain of rolling disasters that can take years or even decades to resolve.
Haiti has long been known as the Republic of Non-Governmental Organizations, the Republic of NGOs. International donors provide funding to NGOs as opposed to funding to the government to perform governmental functions.
The president is in the airport. Why you don't do nothing for us?
We try to ask to help us, at least for the food and water.
Y ahora vamos a ver qué hacemos porque no tenemos medicamentos, no tenemos material para trabajar.
It's unfortunately the case that in Haiti, there were many people who were barely self-sufficient before the earthquake. And the nature of the damage, the social disruption, and the damage to service delivery systems made the recovery all that harder. We're talking about a disaster where merely removing the debris took years.
But it's not just poorer countries at risk of rolling disasters.
Typically, the less developed a society is, probably the less prepared it can be for these major disasters.
Californians need to be prepared because in their state, the Pacific Plate grinds past the North American Plate in a tectonic boundary known as the San Andreas Fault. The fault extends for 1,500 kilometers, arcing right through the richest and most populous state in the U.S. In 1906, the San Andreas Fault was responsible for the destruction of most of San Francisco. Over the last 200 years, California has been hit by about 80 quakes stronger than magnitude 5. San Fernando Valley is a densely populated urban area not far from downtown Los Angeles. 4:30 on a Monday morning, residents of Northridge had no idea what they were about to wake up to. For about 20 seconds, a magnitude 6.7 earthquake shook the city with the strongest ground motion ever recorded in urban North America. A minute later, there was a magnitude 6 aftershock. But this time, the San Andreas Fault was not directly responsible. Ominously, this quake came from a blind thrust fault that was previously unmapped and unknown.
Prepare yourselves! Shut off the gas, shut off electricity, store water in your bathtub. Don't expect services for 72 hours.
Northridge had a blind thrust. That meant that the fault that moved didn't break all the way to the surface. That also means we don't know exactly where the fault is in general until it breaks. And so people who were right above the fault had no way of knowing until the earthquake broke.
It was pitch black and she wasn't crying and she was still, so we thought she was dead.
We're just now starting to get our operating rooms cleaned up. We're still unable to sterilize instruments, so we really can't perform any major surgery.
57 people were killed, some immediately, some within a few days of their injuries, and others from indirect causes, such as stress-induced heart attacks. More than 8,700 people were injured.
Due to the damage caused by the earthquake, I have, by signing the document that I will sign at the end of this statement, declared these areas of California to be a major disaster.
Northridge was a very interesting earthquake from a sociological point of view because it was a major earthquake striking a major U.S. metropolis that was very diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, social class. And it allowed us a window into what future disasters would be like in large urban areas.
Apartment blocks, office buildings, and car parks collapsed. 11 hospitals were damaged or left unusable. About 20,000 people were temporarily homeless.
We also saw that it's possible for a disaster like the Northridge earthquake to create pockets where damage is so heavy that they temporarily at least become ghost towns. These kinds of effects represent real challenges in terms of recovery because it involves not individual units but entire neighborhoods that need to be recovered.
Elevated freeways were smashed and bridges cut. Fortunately, the early hour on a public holiday meant the roads were not packed with traffic at the time.
You can go over there. I can. Okay.
Property damage was estimated to be worth more than $20 billion, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history.
It's just the effect of shaking Los Angeles with a 6.5 right in the middle of the city.
The cost of payouts was so high that many insurance companies either stopped offering or severely restricted earthquake insurance in California. In response, a state authority was established to provide basic insurance.
Here you had a very large metropolitan area with many housing units damaged, many public buildings damaged, hospitals damaged, infrastructure such as freeways damaged. So the costs go up where there are lots and lots of valuable assets.
The most dangerous buildings in an earthquake are those made of unreinforced bricks or concrete blocks.
We talk about better building regulations, building a better future, but you have the other problem of the legacy of the past. And building regulations are not retrospective. So what do you do with the high-risk elements of your community?
Because of California's known seismic hazards, building codes already require new structural design to withstand earthquakes. When the damage revealed that some designs didn't actually work as intended, the earthquake led to a revision of the building codes.
Northridge showed that efforts to mitigate seismically caused damage do work. Los Angeles had started a retrofit program for its old, dangerous buildings. Engineers who looked at buildings that were affected by the Northridge earthquake said that those retrofits really helped.
Retrofits which were enacted after the San Fernando quake in 1971. Hitting at 6 a.m., a 6.6 magnitude earthquake rocked the San Fernando Valley for 12 seconds. Collapsing highways, hospitals, and homes. The quake had also caused parts of the lower San Fernando Dam to collapse, leaving only a thin dirt wall between it and the 80,000 residents below.
Attention all residents. We are evacuating this area immediately.
Worried when I saw the first broadcast what was left of the dam.
In fear of aftershocks, the valley was evacuated as the dam level was lowered. Following this disaster, new building regulations were instituted in California.
If you contrast, say, the San Fernando earthquake in 1971 to the Northridge one, the lessons from that earthquake are translated into better building regulations.
Regulations that proved their worth in 1994, when the Los Angeles Reservoir, a new and improved lower San Fernando Dam, survived unscathed.
So if we think of that objective of building resilient structures, tough structures, ones that would protect life in a major earthquake, the Northridge earthquake largely illustrated the effectiveness of building regulations to do that.
Can a building in an active fault zone be made earthquake resistant?
There are lots of new structures built around that claim that they can be safer from earthquakes.
そこからいざ地震という時にどういう場所で落ち合うとか、駅の近くの風景だとか見せておいた方が子供がいざという時に安心できるかなと思ってずっと来て、で帰りに父親に寄って体験して、今日はもう地震ツアーです。
There are great uncertainties as to our knowledge of just what the earthquake hazard is. Seismologists go to great lengths to understand what has occurred in the past, the understanding of how earthquake waves propagate through the crust. So what often will protect our building through an earthquake or make it perform adequately is a toughness, so that even if it's overloaded, the overall behaviour is a ductile one, it can absorb energy.
Here at the Southern California Earthquake Center, we take our science to these engineers so they can build the safest buildings possible, so that it's a data-informed structure. But again, we just won't really know how it's actually going to function until after the next earthquake.
It might be so badly damaged at the end that it's an economic decision to demolish it and rebuild, but nevertheless, it's a safe structure.
When it comes to building earthquake-resistant skyscrapers, one of the first to capture the public imagination was the 48-story Trans-America Pyramid in San Francisco.
Interestingly, that building, the construction started in 1968, so it was built in the context of US building regulations without the learnings of the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. It's a steel frame structure, so it's got its ductile construction. The mass is concentrated at lower levels by virtue of being a pyramid, and so it has performed well in earthquakes that have occurred in the region, and we would expect it to perform very well in future earthquakes as well.
The Wilshire Grand is the tallest building in California. At 73 stories, it has to withstand the swaying and even whiplash caused by the ground movement in earthquakes.
It's very slender in one direction for architectural reasons. In designing that building, they tried to keep open, unobstructed floor plans, so that led to a central shear core, which provides a lot of the bracing. But they also used a common technique for those taller structures, which we called outriggers. So at 3 levels, they had an outrigger system that reached out to the exterior columns to provide a stabilizing action as well, to stiffen the structure for wind and earthquake.
Like a reed in the wind, it bends in a seismic event. This building is designed to ride out the major credible event in the Los Angeles Basin, which is 8.3 on the San Andreas, coupled with the other local faults.
The 101-story Taipei Tower in Taiwan is among the world's tallest. It's built a few hundred meters away from a major fault line.
This is a very significant day for Taipei 101 project. It's the topping out of the steel structure. And with the spire in place, we will be at 508 meters, which will be the tallest structure in the world.
It's a country which has both severe earthquake and wind hazards, so it suffers from quite strong typhoons. So they made use of a massive tuned mass damper, 660-ton ball suspended over 3 stories at the top of the building.
If a building has a counterweight, as it shifts, it allows the building around it to move left, so that moving weight allows the building to basically flex more gently from the shaking of the earthquake, and then it's easier to build a strong building that will not collapse.
While the tuned mass damper is reported to reduce building movement by about 40%, it's yet to be put to the test by a major earthquake. And that will have much to do with the type of soil Taipei is built on. As our buildings grow taller to help accommodate an exploding population, the very land that supports their foundations can exacerbate the effects of an earthquake.
One of the common problems in earthquakes is that the cities are built in kind of low-lying flat areas near rivers and ports, and often that means the geological structure underneath is very soft soil and wet soil.
The composition of the geological layers below our cities has a dramatic effect on the way seismic waves propagate.
Soft sediment increases the earthquake waves in a couple of ways. Soft sediment doesn't take so much energy to move that much, so you get much larger waves for the same amount of energy. The other way is through what's called resonance. So resonance is a phenomenon like if you strike a bell, it will vibrate at certain frequencies.
Just like a struck bell, the rocky layers embracing the soft sedimentary ones within a basin can amplify seismic waves.
If the earthquake has happened within the basin or beneath the basin, the earthquake energy can be reflected back into the basin.
As the wave reflects, it will start bouncing around, and you'll get a system of waves that are sort of being reflected back and forth, and that will cause the basin to resonate. And this can be a real problem if that resonant frequency matches the frequency of buildings.
The problem is that when buildings resonate at the same frequency as the seismic waves, they shake themselves to bits. What devastated Port-au-Prince wasn't just rickety buildings. Because the city is built on loose soil, the shaking was amplified.
Well, soft sediment is most like a jello on a plate. If you shake the plate a little bit, the jello shakes a lot. And so Port-au-Prince on the soft ground shook much more than the buildings on the nearby hard ground.
And like the one in Northridge, the Haiti earthquake was also from a blind thrust fault that nobody knew existed.
A blind thrust fault is a fault that actually doesn't reach the surface, so you can't see easily where that fault occurs. When that earthquake first occurred, we looked at the maps of fault, we looked at aerial pictures, and there's a large strike-slip fault that runs through southern Haiti. And then we went in afterwards and did surveys and looked at how the ground moved by looking at displacement of corals and GPS measurements, and it became apparent that that wasn't the main culprit. There may have been some movement on that fault, but it was more likely a blind thrust fault off that main strand in Haiti that caused the shaking and caused the damage. And this is not the best news for Haiti because you can have another earthquake on that major surface fault that goes through
it. With Haiti's earthquake, the combination of no warning, unknown fault, amplified shaking, vulnerable population, and low-quality buildings was lethal on a tragically epic scale.
People were, of course, accustomed to living in very substandard conditions, even before the earthquake. But the displacement of people, the breaking of their social ties, their neighborhood ties.
Just like, you know, when you sleep in the night, you got one eye open, one eye closed. You don't ever sleep well.
The placement of some of the emergency camps was not all that it could have been in terms of access to jobs and transportation.
Il n'y a aucune instance concernée, même au niveau de l'État, qui vient passer pour le peuple qui a souffert là. Nous n'avons pas de l'eau, nous n'avons pas de manger, nous n'avons pas de santé.
So there were a lot of additional stressors that people were experiencing that could lead to poor health outcomes.
You have an urgent need to provide accommodation for people, and that's one of the challenges that they've had in Haiti. Now that they're rebuilding, it's very hard to enforce better building regulations because people have this urgency, and the old practices do tend to come back because often they're cheaper and more understood. So you can have quite a challenge of building back better so that you're ending up with a more resilient community after the event.
Apart from the challenge of building houses that won't collapse, there's another problem for seismologists: finding ways to give people as much warning as possible.
Fundamentally, earthquake monitoring has been the same for a long time. We have a lot of seismometers. We can tell where earthquakes happen, how big they are. We can try to understand the fault systems. One of the new elements is earthquake early warning, which is a network we're building now to warn people before the shaking hits them. It turns out if you see an earthquake starting and can understand what's happening, you can tell people there's shaking that is coming but hasn't reached them yet. You can get anywhere from a few seconds to, at very best, a few minutes of warning to people, and then they can do what you can do in a few seconds or minutes, which we think that should cut the costs and casualties by tens of %, maybe a factor of 2, if we can take the right actions.
We can't predict exactly how big and where an earthquake will be, but we can predict regions that are more likely to have earthquakes than other regions, and regions that are potentially closer to having a very large earthquake than other regions.
One of those seismic hotspots where earthquakes are likely is the Himalayas, the biggest collision of plate tectonics happening on Earth today.
The Himalayas have been formed over millions of years as the Indian subcontinent impinges upon Eurasia. This causes the mountains to rise as the Indian plate subducts beneath the Eurasian plate.
The Indian plate doesn't really want to go down. It's composed of light material. It doesn't want to go down beneath the Asian plate.
Kashmir is disputed territory between India, Pakistan, and China. Its rugged mountainous landscape is dominated by the Himalayas and the tectonic stresses built up deep below. One October morning in 2005, Kashmir was slammed by a magnitude 7.6 earthquake. Unlike the strike-slip quakes in Haiti and Northridge, this was an oblique slip with potentially more deadly ground movement.
एकदम से 5 सेकंड क्या चीज होती है? I think 5 सेकंड से जल्दी कुछ भी नहीं होता.
We are doing all the rescue operation. There are people inside.
The earthquake in Kashmir in 2005 was actually a mix of what we would call a thrust earthquake, one plate riding up over the other, and a strike-slip earthquake, one plate moving sideways. So an oblique earthquake is one that has elements of both. One side's rising, but it's also moving laterally.
Kashmir was vulnerable because you had a large population center and you had a number of buildings that could not withstand strong shaking. Additionally, it was a mountainous region, so you can have landslides that can cover entire towns.
We could see a lot of hilltops that were shattered. The buildings looked thoroughly disrupted and in many cases collapsed.
An estimated 3 million people were left homeless. More than 80,000 people perished.
मुजफ्फराबाद में बहुत तबाही हुई है, बहुत लाशें पड़ी अभी मलबे के नीचे हैं और बहुत लाशें दफना चुके हैं हम और पूरा शहर तकरीबन तबाह हो चुका है.
Of those killed, a staggering 19,000 were children.
So typically the schools were load-bearing brick walls, quite heavy concrete slabs, often multiple stories, and even the roofs often were concrete slabs as well. So what happened there was the timing was unfortunate because it was during school time, the classrooms were full.
The strategy basically they will have to dig into the building. We'll try to reach to the people and whatever we can find.
The Kashmir earthquake was a watershed for change, and in 2007 the building regulations did change. They align quite closely with world standard building regulations, notably the ones in the US, the Uniform Building Code. And then also there was an improved assessment of the seismic hazard in Pakistan, because if you want to design for earthquakes, you need to understand the likelihood of ground shaking.
While tragedy may have forced change, the Himalayan region remains vulnerable to earthquakes, partly due to its remote and inaccessible nature.
It can be extremely difficult because you have a lot of landslides which cover roads, which isolate towns. The only way to get resources in are via helicopters. And it can take a long time even to figure out how much damage has occurred in a region like that.
Get out here! Oh shit!
The magnitude 7.8 earthquake in Nepal in 2015 killed 9,000. More than 3 million were made homeless, with entire villages flattened.
We just felt some fresh tremors here. Big pieces of ice just came down from this glacier today.
The quake triggered a disaster on Mount Everest when an avalanche swept into the base camp where several hundred climbers were staying. At least 19 people were killed, with 120 others injured or missing.
बाप भी ऐसा हो गया, मेरा बेटी भी चल गया, मेरा पैर टूट गया, इसमें पैंटी भी टूट गया, बहुत दिक्कत है, मेरे पास कुछ नहीं है.
More than 300 people disappeared after a landslide nearly 2 miles wide engulfed several villages in the Langtang Valley. Although hampered by heavy rainfall, landslides, and aftershock, Nepalese soldiers mobilized for search and rescue, managing to find survivors for a week after the earthquake. International teams, French, Polish, American, swung into action to assist.
We're told that there's voices heard in a void space. We're going to go out, hopefully locate that victim, and we're going to go ahead and have the rescue squad come in and help extricate that victim out of the hole.
5 days after the quake, there was jubilation as 15-year-old Pemba Tamang was pulled free from the rubble of Kathmandu, unharmed.
It's what we call an entombment. So he wasn't specifically crushed, but what he was inside of a box with heavy concrete all around him. So we worked side by side with the local teams, and we were there to assist them in getting this victim out.
The level of damage was deep and widespread. Many fear that destruction like this could become more common in Nepal. Across the Himalayas is what seismologists call a slip deficit, or a seismic gap. Without enough earthquakes to relieve the stress that's known to be accumulating between the tectonic plates, there is the potential that several very large and catastrophic quakes could be unleashed. A growing concern across Nepal.
As these plates move past each other, they're not slipping, stress builds up all along that plate boundary. Part of that plate boundary might rupture in a large earthquake. But then there'll be some parts of the boundary that didn't rupture. And so you have to wonder, well, what's happening there? The other more worrying situation is that it's accumulating energy. So if there's part of the plate boundary that's not slipping, that's referred to as a seismic gap. And so that Nepal earthquake occurred in a seismic gap. It didn't completely fill that gap. So it would be a mistake to think that has relieved all the stress and there won't be further earthquakes.
Although Nepal's quake was devastating, earthquakes of that moment magnitude are fairly common. Each year, 14 magnitude 7 earthquakes and at least 1 magnitude 8 occur. But when it comes to rating earthquakes on their strength, what does the moment magnitude scale measure?
Before the moment magnitude scale was developed in the 70s, we really relied on the amount of shaking that was observed in an earthquake to determine how big that earthquake is. It's a very simple measurement. But The moment magnitude scale is important because it's proportional to the area of the fault that ruptured in that earthquake and also the amount that fault moved in the earthquake. And so it's a more physical measurement than simply looking at the shaking from the earthquake.
Magnitude's a number that's logarithmic, and what that means is every time you step by a magnitude unit, you're increasing the motion by about a factor of 10 and the energy by about a factor of 30.
At a magnitude of 7.8, Nepal's 2015 earthquake released about 16 times more energy than Haiti's magnitude 7 shock. But the strength of these devastating earthquakes pales in comparison to the largest in recorded history. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake hit Chile at a moment magnitude of 9.5. Over 5,500 times stronger than Haiti. But the energy an earthquake releases does not always translate into human devastation. As the months rolled by, Haiti's vulnerability to disaster was exposed. Recovery was slow to start, and to this day, remains a work in progress. With so many unburied bodies, the conditions after the quake led to concerns of a disease epidemic. An outbreak arose from sewage discharging into a river, but from an unexpected source.
And one of the most tragic things that came out of Haiti was that the UN contingent of soldiers that was sent in from Nepal set off a cholera epidemic that killed additional thousands of people and affected a high proportion of the entire population.
Quant à la source de provenance et de propagation de cette épidémie, ce point-là, eh bien, déplacé, évacué, base de malaise, toute la carte.
6 years after the outbreak, cholera was still killing around 40 people every month. In 2017, about 800,000 people, 7% of the population, had been infected with cholera, and more than 9,000 Haitians had died. Although earthquakes are a natural part of life, that doesn't mean we should be complacent and unprepared.
A lot of times we see that when there's a big earthquake, that's the wake-up call. But the wake-up call should just be knowing that you live in an area where earthquakes are common or can happen.
How we build, where we live, and how we learn can be the difference between life and death.
In Haiti, as in many, many parts of the less developed world, you have settlements springing up and growing in areas that are inherently hazardous.
As our population explodes and the dangers earthquakes represent increase, our quest to understand and predict these events could save the lives of millions.
I used to find earthquakes scientifically interesting, and you see the damage that these earthquakes can cause. You see the impact that they can have. And they're no longer, to me, a scientific curiosity. They're really an enemy.